Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Paul W.S. Anderson's film Death Race. Now, I had done a video a while back about Death Race 2000, the 1978 film. Death Race, the 2008 film, this is a sort of update, a modernization of it. There's some elements that are clearly the same, and there's some elements that are very, very different. We have the character of Frankenstein, who is this masked racer, much beloved by the crowd. But because he is a masked racer, it actually doesn't depend on the same person being behind the mask every time. You can have different drivers play Frankenstein. And the premise is that at the beginning of this film, the existing Frankenstein has died in a crash, and so Jensen Ames, played by Jason Statham, is sort of framed for murdering his wife so that he will be put in this prison so that he can be coerced by Hennessy, the prison warden, into driving as Frankenstein so they can keep ratings on the show up. The premise of the Death Race in both films essentially is that this is a kind of race car style blood sport, right? The objective is to survive the race and to kill off as many of your competitors as possible. This is dystopian in both instances. This is a sort of imagined future America. In 1978, I think it's imagined as being the year 2000. And in the 2008 film, it's imagined as being 2012, so really just right around the corner, which in a way was probably a terrible plan because 2012 looked nothing like Death Race. Trust me, bro, I was there. The sort of so that's kind of the major similarities, right? We follow Frankenstein, or in this case, Jensen Ames, who adopts the Frankenstein persona. We are meant to be repulsed by the idea of the race, despite the fact that in both films it's incredibly popular. Like it is probably more popular than something like WWE, something like pro wrestling. Probably more in the vein of American football in the US, or hockey in Canada, or soccer in much of the rest of the world. It's just an incredibly popular thing. And people die all the time doing it. So those are some of the sort of overlaps, similarities between them. But there's a couple of major differences as well. And I think they're important. One is that so in Death Race, the 2008 film, this is set in a prison. So there's a major difference, because in Death Race 2000, the 1978 version, this is just out in the world, right? There's a course that these drivers have to drive across the US, and part of what they have to do is kill as many people as they can. Like, they get points for kills. So if you kill a baby, that's more points than if you kill an adult male, or whatever it is, whatever their system of ranking is, right? In Death Race, there is not that. That doesn't exist. It is a closed track within a prison, and you have to kill the other racers. But there's not necessarily a sort of points system, right? Because in Death Race 2000, you have to both win the race and collect up the most points. And you get points for killing other drivers as well. But in Death Race, there's no point system, really. It's you have to survive, you have to kill other drivers, and in the last there's 3 rounds. In the 3rd round, you have to come in first, basically. So there's a couple of significant reasons that distinction matters, that it's set in a prison versus being out in the world. One is that the people in the prison are not generally that sympathetic. So we know that Jensen Ames, our protagonist, has been falsely convicted for a crime he didn't commit. Coach, his sort of the lead of his tech team and the person who sort of takes him through how to be Frankenstein, he has served his term and just sort of not chosen to go back out into the world, but everybody else is a prisoner, and many of them are seemingly reprehensible. This is standard prison movie type stuff, where you have the white supremacists, you have the arbitrary violence, you have gang rivalries, etc., etc., and people have significant body counts. So there isn't really that much sort of concern when somebody like Pachenko or Grimm or whoever it is gets killed. Like, we're kind of okay with that. Pachenko is a rival driver who actually we sort of more or less learn that he was the one who killed Ames's wife in order to frame Ames to get him in there at Hennessy, the warden's command. So whereas in Death Race 2000, like, you're not necessarily hopefully you're not necessarily rooting for like random pedestrians on a street to be brutally run down by these cars. But in Death Race, when Pachenko or Grimm or whoever, these sort of terrible people get killed, you're not really that sad about it. And I think that matters, in part because if this is a dystopia, right, it's harder to build a dystopian world in which the victims of the dystopia kind of deserve it. Not that they kind of deserve a dystopian world, but in the sense that, like, if these people are terrible, and we agree that they should be in prison, they should be suffering, whatever it is, then we're less sympathetic to the general aims of stopping it, right? When it's a situation where they're just running over random everyday people just trying to go about their lives and whatever it is, that's a much more sympathetic situation. We don't generally believe that regular everyday people should randomly be killed for entertainment. Whereas there are large segments of the population who believe that people in prison deserve to suffer. And that is in itself an ethically problematic and concerning position to hold, but it's also a very common one. So, again, there's that element to it. We're not as concerned about the deaths of these people who we would probably agree, many of us would probably agree, represent some sort of threat to society in general. So I think that's a really significant difference. Another really significant difference, and I don't think that this is an incidental difference in that case, given what I just said about the closed world of a prison of violent criminals versus the open world of a cross-country race, is that the objective at the end for Frankenstein is very, very different between the two films. In Death Race 2000, Frankenstein, played by David Carradine, I think David Carradine, one of the Carradines. Frankenstein in the original film, like, his ultimate objective is to undercut the government that runs this race, that has this dystopian autocratic power. His goal is a liberatory one for this society. Like, he wants to eliminate the president who has set up this autocratic system so that people can have freedom. In Death Race, in the 2008 version, the goal of Jensen Ames is to get out of prison. He wants to go and get his daughter, and he ultimately is joined by, and that's what they ultimately do. Like, he and Machine Gun Joe, who is another driver who has this sort of deadly rivalry with Frankenstein, Ames and Machine Gun Joe sort of get together and say, all right, let's hatch a plot so that we can escape from this prison using the tools that they have given us. And that's what they ultimately do. Like, so they go to Mexico. Ames gets his daughter. They're joined by Case, who is Frankenstein's navigator. And that's it. Like, their whole objective is just like, let's go fix up cars in Mexico and just sort of live quiet, simple lives or something like that. Like, there is no liberatory ethos to it. The world remains the terrible place of economic collapse, dystopian autocratic government. Death Race is presumably still going, even though Hennessy gets killed at the end. But it's not clear that she was really the driving force behind it so much as ratings. It is a capitalist game, right? Everything that is done in the Death Race is done for ratings, to get more eyes on the screen, more people subscribing to watch each lap, etc., etc. I don't have any real strong belief that with Hennessy dead, the Death Race franchise would collapse in this society. And even if it did, you are still in a society where law and order law as such seems to have been replaced with authoritarianism. Society is not measurably better at the end of Death Race, whereas there's at least the potential for society as a whole to get measurably better at the end of Death Race 2000. And I think to some degree there may be I think we were more hopeful as a society in the 70s, even by the late 70s, with all of the things that had sort of started going off the rails. But in the early to mid 2000s, and I mean 2008 is late 2000, sure, but the film itself would have been conceptualized and made earlier on. I think there was much less hopefulness. I mean, this was the era of the War on Terror, the Patriot Act, the imprisonment of people in Guantanamo Bay with no charges, no trials, no access to lawyers, being tortured, etc., etc. I think there's a lot less hope that society as a whole could get better. I don't know. I mean, and that's maybe in a sort of overly limited thing, because I also don't think that. I also think there's an element of individualism that limits the possibilities this film is willing to imagine. That the possibilities that Death Race is willing to imagine, right? Societal problems are not societal problems, they're individual problems, right? And this is the neoliberal narrative, the bootstraps narrative, the don't look at questions of social justice or social injustice. Instead, take personal responsibility, even if that requires pretending that society level problems don't exist and they're just about individual choices, successes, or failures. I think Death Race very much reflects that ideology because, again, the happy ending of the film is, hey, we've escaped. We're living out of prison. Everyone else, still in prison. Autocratic social structure still exists. We have not done anything about that because that's a societal problem. We have pulled ourselves up by our bootstraps and illegally escaped from prison, killing a bunch of people, and therefore we're the good guys.